It's an absolute pleasure to see you all here this evening. Thank you for coming to this event. My name is Andrew Reeser. I'm a professor of history in the History, Government, and Economics Department at Dutchess Community College, and the holder of this year's Handel Family Endowed Faculty Chair to perpetuate the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Now is a good moment for me to ask all of us to silence any things that go beep or buzz or would otherwise make a sound during tonight's event. I'm glad to see as many students as I see, including a few of my own. I'd like to make a special appeal to students to stay for the Q&A as well. And I promise we'll get you out by the conclusion of tonight's event, which will be 8:30. I'd like to thank Dutchess Community College President Peter Jordan and Executive Director of the DCCF Foundation, Diana Pollard, and her outstanding staff, the entire staff of the DCCF Foundation, for their support of public lectures like this and to make all of this happen. Please join me in thanking Dr. Jordan and Executive Director Ms. Pollard. So this entire lecture series, which is now about 2 decades ongoing, is the brainchild of and made possible by the Handel family, whose wisdom, foresight, and generosity has enriched the life of this college for more than 2 decades. It's been a privilege for me to hold this chair on a couple of occasions during my 20-year tenure at the college. The Handel family's example of engaged citizenship and intellectual curiosity, their understanding of how access to education is essential to a functioning democracy, their deep and abiding faith in the community college mission. All of this has been an inspiration to me. Shirley Handel has been living out those principles for decades as a part of a philanthropic partnership team with her husband, Bern, who I'll mention in just a moment, and her family. We are deeply grateful for her support, for her and her support. I'd like Shirley Handel, if she could, to stand for a moment so we could all thank you for your contributions to this event. Thank you, Shirley. I'd like to mark a moment that is in equal measure sorrowful and hopeful. There have been scores of these Handel events over the last 2 decades. This is the first to occur after the passing of Bern Handel. Bern Handel, husband of Shirley for 57 years, passed away at September 1st at the age of 97. His accomplishments are too voluminous to quickly summarize. I would like to just mark the occasion with just 2 requests, right, if you'll allow me. For some of the younger folks in the audience, I have a suggestion. As you are well aware, you're at the starting line of a long life to come. Our time on this planet is finite. If perchance you're wondering what can be accomplished in life, what can be accomplished especially by a working class kid, the son of immigrants who attended public schools, took night classes in college. That's a profile that isn't far from the profile of many of us here at Dutchess Community College. If you're wondering what can be accomplished in a life that begins in such circumstances, in such a fashion, then at some point, not right now because you already put away your devices, right? But at some point, I'd like you to Google Bernard Handel obituary, okay? Bernard Handel obituary. Right, at some point, and just read it. And what you'll read about is someone who served his country in war, founded an insurance accounting business, and co-founded essentially co-founder of the AARP, served on countless college nonprofit boards, earned an honorary doctorate from SUNY. You'll see that he dedicated himself to democratic ideals, especially access to education for all. Now, we're not all going to live a life quite that extraordinary, but we can be inspired by it, right? As we can be inspired by his life. The second request is focused on all of us, but some older members of the audience. A little audience participation. Are you ready? So the millennials and Gen Z have come up with this great way of celebrating something. Instead of clapping, which can be loud and is not always great for folks who are sensitive of hearing, they do this. Right? It's a way of celebrating something, but in maybe a less intrusive way. This is what I'd like to do. I'd like to have 5 seconds of snapping in honor of Bern Handel, in celebration for the Handel family and their past, present, and ongoing commitment to the democratic ideals that we all stand for here at Dutchess Community College. Can we do that? Here we go. About 5 seconds. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, cool. I didn't know how that was going to go, but I thought that was cool. It sounded cool, like rain. Maybe Bern would have liked that. Let me introduce the panelists so I can get off the stage. You're no doubt looking forward to that. But I want to offer a quick product promotion. For this panel presentation tonight is about something, and it's something really quite extraordinary. It's a temporary exhibit. You can see some of the titles and some of the photographs, as I'll show you just a couple of more in just a moment. Currently on display at the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, just up the road in FDR. How many folks have attended and visited this exhibit that we're about to talk about? Show of hands. All right. That's actually pretty cool. It's like a critical mass. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, please consider it. It's quite an experience. Holidays coming up, a chance for you to bring perhaps visiting family to see something. Let me just offer my greatest hits, right? And I promise I'll get off the stage quickly as we want to hear from our panelists. 3 quick themes that emerged from my couple of visits to this remarkable exhibit. One of the most important ones is redemption. And I mean that in both a religious and a spiritual and in a secular sense, because the first 2 rooms provide a biography of Eleanor and Franklin, but not an expansive full narrative. That would take up 20 rooms, right? But it's like a cross-sectional, sort of diagonal biographical critique of their upbringing as kids, as young adults, and right into their 20s. And what we find is a quite bold and brave critique of the very namesake for the entire institution, right? It's a quite remarkable feature, is the willingness to critique, right? Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. They did grow up in the bastion of privilege, Northeastern establishment privilege, in the very center of socioeconomic class and, quite frankly, unexamined racial privilege as well. And as young people, as young adults, they were unself-conscious and unaware, in many respects, of their privilege, to the point where they affected certain aristocratic speech patterns and attitudes, and as this wonderful exhibit in this wonderfully self-critical moment reveals, engaged in some prejudicial language, right, and traded in some racial stereotypes as well. Redemption. Right, so as we go through this story of Franklin, Eleanor, and Roosevelt, what we find is the 2 of them learning, experiencing, evolving, and changing. Right, whether it's a full redemption or a partial one, it's exciting to watch. And layered on top of the story of 2 people changing, transforming, evolving, confronting the paradoxes of American democracy, what Gunnar Myrdal called the American dilemma, the fundamental contradiction between a society committed to the principle of equality under the law, and yet which in the mid-20th century is practicing rampant discrimination based on race. It's a fundamental contradiction, right? And what we find is their broadening of their moral horizons, and that then is layered and happens at the same time as a national awakening. It's such an exciting feature of this exhibit. Go and see it yourself, right? And explore that really wonderful theme of redemption, or let's say partial redemption, right, for the Roosevelts and for the country as a whole. The second theme that came for me is courage, the courage of Howard University students protesting lynching, protesting their own government's unwillingness to take action in response to the the injustice of systematic lynching in the South. The courage of Mary Bethune, A. Philip Randolph, and other civil rights activists who are using bravery and courage, tapping that to force the issue. Much attention is paid to the increasing power of the black vote because of the Great Migration and the arrival of African Americans in the Democratic Party. But what we learned from this exhibit is that African Americans weren't invited into the Democratic Party. They had to force their way into it. Another example of courage and bravery. And drama. The drama of the NAACP's efforts to force the issue, the drama of the 1936 Democratic Convention that happened on the floor of that convention, the drama of Marian Anderson's concert in 1937. One of my favorite photographs I've borrowed here. It appears there on the left, as thousands gathered to celebrate a moment of racial inclusion. The drama of the Tuskegee Airmen's formation and bravery, the drama of FDR's passing, and the post-war years of activism for civil and human rights by Eleanor Roosevelt until her passing in 1963. If you find redemption, courage, and drama interesting, then come see this exhibit. There, how's that for a little promo? Is that all right? So it's my great privilege to introduce speakers who know far more about these topics. And our format is simple. They get to talk and we get to listen, which is awesome. I cannot wait. Before we welcome each one of them to the stage, just a few words of introduction. So let me introduce the first of our panelists. Mr. Eberhart will then walk over, take a seat at the farthest seat, and then we'll go on in this fashion. So Herman Eberhart is the supervisory curator of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum. He has over 30 years of experience as curator and interpretive planner of museum exhibitions. He was a principal member of the teams that created the permanent exhibits at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. At FDR Museum and Library, he directs the work of the museum staff, manages and curates the museum's permanent exhibition, directs programs for special exhibitions gallery. Please join me in welcoming Herman Eberhart to the stage. William A. Harris is currently the director of the FDR Presidential Library Museum, but he began his career at a different one, the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. Later, he served in a senior role within the National Archives Office of Presidential Libraries, assisted in the transition of the Nixon Presidential Library from a private institution to a National Archives-operated library museum. Upon his promotion to deputy director to director of FDR, Anne Roosevelt, that name should be familiar, of course, chair of the Roosevelt Institute, offered this high praise. My grandparents would be so pleased to know of William Harris's appointment as director of the FDR Museum and Library. FDR knew that libraries reflect the power of a nation's people to learn from the past. Bill Harris embodies this belief. Please join me in welcoming William Harris to the stage. Tanisha Means is an assistant professor of political science and the class of 1951 chair at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Her PhD in political science is from Duke University. Her teaching and research interests are in racial and ethnic politics, judicial politics, and American political behavior and identities. Her forthcoming book project called Representation and Justice in State Courts explores the behaviors of 21st century Black state court judges and answers a set of research questions at the intersection of race and judicial politics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tanisha Means. Jeffrey Urban is the education specialist and director of the Per Lawrence Film Center at FDR Presidential Library Museum. He's responsible for developing all of the library's educational programs and materials for students ranging from second grade to college, and including adult learning public programs across the country. He's the recipient of the 2023 Archivist's Award for Excellence in Leadership in Advancing Education Programs. But my favorite fact about Jeff Urban, actually of many, I've got a few favorites, if one of which we were sharing at dinner, is that he is a product of Dutchess Community College, where he graduated. With the HGE department's own Professor Todd Wilmot, who I see in the back, a colleague of Jeff's, now professor at Dutchess Community College, and not long after receiving our department's most prestigious student achievement award called the Sheridan Award. So his name is literally engraved in brass, hanging on the wall of our department. We think of and see him often on our wall. He also taught at Dutchess Community College before moving to his current role at FDR. Please join me in welcoming back Jeffrey Urban to the stage. So the format is simple. Jeff, Tanisha, Bill, and Herman. So we're transitioning to first names here, where we know each other, we're acquainted, colleagues. Jeff, Tanisha, Bill, and Herman will chat with one another. We get to listen. Jeff will moderate. We have some prepared questions, he does, but no script. So we're like a jazz quartet here, right? We're improvising in the moment. The chat will end around 8 o'clock, 8:05. I can be a timekeeper because I want to leave time for Q&A at the end. And the panelists, I'm sure, would be delighted to hear questions from the audience. So around that time, I'll sort of magically reappear on the stage, right, as MC for the Q&A. And we'll conclude by 8:30. Make sense? Good? Good? All right. Jeff, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. It's a delight and a pleasure for me to be back at the place where I started my career. And it's also wonderful to be on the stage with such a distinguished panel. What we tried to do tonight to sort of seed the clouds here is we've got Bill, who's going to represent the idea of what the role of an institution like a presidential library is. We've got Herman here to talk about the process of putting together the exhibit. And Tanisha here is going to talk about the educational value and how she's used it with her students. This exhibit opened in June of 2023, and it's going to close at the end of February 2025. So those of you who did not have your hands up as having seen it, you need to get over there. Okay, you need to get over there. You've only got about 3 months left. It's earned very favorable reviews in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and it received the Archivist's Achievement Award from the Archivist of the United States, Dr. Colleen Shogan. And as it moves into its home stretch, we wanted to offer the opportunity to talk a little bit about how it came to be, how folks are using it, and again, just remind you that you've only got 3 months left to take a peek. So I want to throw the first question out to Bill, and as Andrew said, this is a discussion, so anybody can feel free to hop in at any moment. Bill, this exhibit has had a really impressive run in terms of attendance and also reception by the public. As the director of the Roosevelt Presidential Library, can you describe the role that our institution plays and serves in presenting both our permanent and temporary exhibits?
Yes, it's a big question, but I want to sort of turn around the way I like to think about the response. And the accolades are great, but in a way, an institution like a presidential library almost shouldn't get an accolade for doing what's right, for doing what a public institution such as ours should do. A presidential library, there's good things and bad things. There's criticism and there are positives about them. But one can say that the Roosevelt Library especially, in transforming the notion of what access to presidential materials, which didn't really exist in any sort of a consistent form before that, and providing that those materials for free to the American people, that then vested with that institution with his name on it a great responsibility, a huge responsibility, not just to be an ongoing commercial for the president, and not just to reflect that president or his family's or his political views or beliefs, but also the American people's. And our archives there, all 17 million pages, have the stories of many Americans, not just the Roosevelts. So to do an exhibit like this as an institution, as someone who's responsible for managing this, is one, the right thing to do. It's the responsible thing to do. Because what it does is it provides an opportunity, well, to highlight that every American story is actually in those records. And that if we just think about it a little differently in how we tell those stories, then we can tell it from the people's perspective and not just from the power down. So you know,
Yeah.
that's
Bill mentioned that we have 17 million pages of documents. Just to put that in a visual for you, that would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stack them all on top of each other. And from those archives, from that material, we culled the information in order to create these exhibits. But of course, also the general public is welcome to come into the research room as well. So that brings us to Herman. You've got this temporary gallery space. Obviously, you're in charge and responsible for all the exhibits that we have, but we do these ongoing, changing temporary galleries. How do you go about telling the story of civil rights in America, or in the Roosevelt era, in what is it, 2,000 square feet?
It's about 2,500 square feet, which is not a really large gallery, and it was definitely a challenge. This is a big story with a lot of fascinating characters in it. Yeah, it was a huge challenge. We do changing exhibits all the time in that gallery, but often they're a bit more narrow in their focus in terms of what we're trying to do. Here we had this story which really begins in 1932 when FDR is inaugurated as president. It goes all the way up through World War II and in post-war with Eleanor Roosevelt, who only passed away in 1962. So we cover 3 decades of history here with a really amazing stories to tell. So yes, it was hard. We try to find what the essential elements in the story are, and that is very time consuming. You don't just go into a subject like this and understand what the themes are, what the major themes are. You have to sort of study it and spend a lot of time immersing yourself in the sources before those things emerge. This exhibit was 3 years in the making. And the first year was entirely meeting with a committee of historians that we assembled. We had 10 historians on this project, led by David Levering Lewis, who is the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the leader of the committee. And we just met with them over a period of a year just to begin to get our hands around the story. And it's only after you've done that and really immersed yourself in the sources that you begin to see what the primary themes are. And then that's how you organize your story in a space that is not as big as you would hope it to be. So we put a lot of story in a small space.
So what is that process like? You just read everything you could possibly get your hands on, look at the documents, and then just let the story begin to tell itself, or what's the process in that?
Well, it's partly that. It's partly immersing yourself in the literature. But I think also, and Bill can speak to this too, it was an effort across the whole library. One of the things that was really exciting for us was the archivists who we always collaborate with on the exhibits. I have a museum staff, but we work with the archivists at the library. They were going into our collections and going into areas of the collection that maybe hadn't been looked at closely to find evidence that would support the stories that we wanted to tell. So it's partially reading up on the secondary literature and mastering that. It's partially listening to the experts and getting ideas from them about how to structure the story. But it's also about going into your own collections and finding things that you didn't know were there.
And I would just add to that, that I'm an archivist, that's my background, and that in thinking about the collection in a different way, sort of reversing the perspective that you would bring to the papers from Roosevelt, and the leaders, and thinking about it differently opens the collection up all over again. It makes it fresh and new in a different way. It's exciting, actually, because you then begin to realize how much more is there and what stories are there and what's reflected there.
Now, Tanisha, you have used our temporary gallery quite extensively since it's been up. You've brought large numbers of students there on several different occasions. What were you hoping that the students would take away from the visit there, from the exhibit?
I was excited. So I only came to know about the exhibit through the Poughkeepsie Public Library. They held an event there one evening, and I came with my grandmother. And I remember talking to her, saying that I had been to a number of different exhibits, not at FDR, but in other places where I've been or have gone to panels, and the topic seemed really great and interesting to me as a person who is a political scientist, but also has a background in Africana studies. And so I was really excited in that regard. But I just remember being hesitant or maybe cautious or questioning. I didn't know the FDR Museum before I came for that visit. And so I wondered what the story would be. Would it be a glorification of him and some kind of idealization of him and his time? Or would there be real hard truths there that are painful? But I feel that a lot of times in terms of like K-12 schooling and other conversations that are happening nationally, there is a resistance to those kinds of real truths. And so I went into the museum, just curious to see what I would find. I would say open to it, but curious. And so I remember going in, and for me, it was the opening of the exhibit, the first room, that on the left side has the sort of stories of Roosevelt just growing up, and then on the right side are sort of the context of the times, right? And I just remember walking in and seeing a lot of the images that I was familiar with in terms of my Africana studies background, and so I felt like that was a really great sign, and that I wouldn't have proceeded further if that initial opening wasn't what I thought to be sort of reflective of what I knew. And I walked through and sort of took my time. I went back to a couple of places, just really engaging with the letters and all of the other primary sources. And then at the end of it, I remarked to my grandmother, "This was really well done. This was great." And then I said, "I wonder who was a part of it." And then when I saw the list, I said, "Okay, this is great," right? Like so many of the people that I read in graduate school, for example. And so I thought to myself about my students. Like I was going as just a person in the community, right? I was also going for my grandmother, who's 80 years old, who grew up during this time, and wondering what she would feel and what she would remember, what would resonate with her in terms of those stories. And so I thought to myself about the context in which we are all living in terms of resistance to truth-telling, the grappling with racism in this country and racial histories in this country. And I said I wanted my students to experience this. I wanted them to be a researcher, to go out into the community, right? The Presidential Library is right here in our neighborhood. Mm-hmm. At Vassar, there's this common idea of the Vassar bubble, that students find themselves locked in on campus in a residential college. What would it mean to go out of that space? And so for me, I thought about all of the classes that I teach. I teach classes dealing with media and politics, classes dealing with law and courts, and then classes dealing with just like regular American politics, like a general introductory class. And I thought for all of the lessons that I teach, one thing that is true, no matter what the topic is there is a story of race. Because in this country, you can't teach American politics, no matter what the specific topic is, without a conversation about race. And what I found in this special exhibit was there was something for everything that I teach. And so I have, I'm going to share it with Jeff later on, but one of the assignments that I had my students do was to take a picture of anything in the exhibit that resonated with them in our syllabus, things that they had engaged with in the classroom, and then to write on the side of it a paragraph about why it resonated and what it meant to them. And that was really a treat. And so it will be available. I mean, I don't know how it can be available, but I'm going to share it broadly. But I found that students really went into the space open to what it could teach them. And for them, I would say their education was very similar to my own K-12 education. In terms of the story, I mean, you said stories, the stories we tell. The stories we tell about the New Deal, the stories we tell about Japanese incarceration, the stories we tell about, the first judicial appointees in terms of diversification, right? Diversification of the courts, and who was responsible for that. All of the stories that we tell, it was very interesting to be in that space and to grapple with things that were produced at that time, right? These images that were shown, right? There's music that's there. Like it really, you engage with all of your senses. And I thought about how the K-12 system, at least generally speaking in this country, it hasn't done the best job of really highlighting these narratives and these stories. And so what would it mean for students who, for example, think about the New Deal in this very universal way without thinking about how it was disproportionately sort of, that the resources were not divided and open to everyone? What would that mean for them to reckon with that? And so I wanted to provide the opportunity for students to do that in my classroom space.
Great. I remember one day the bus pulls up and 90 students get off, and she's, sorry, those of you in my political science, you go this way. Those of you in communications, you go that way. Those of you in judicial, go that way. And so you really just threw them right into it. But you raise an interesting point, and Andrew hinted at it in his introduction, that really the Roosevelt record on race is mixed. It's not a straight path. There are stumbles. There are some things that are really, in many ways, big leaps forward, but also there are opportunities where there are some missed opportunities. And I think one of the things, and Herman and Bill can speak to this, I think that we struggle to do, or that we try to do, and from your remarks, it makes it sound like we're doing it, at least on this exhibit, is that we're trying to present the whole story. We're trying to present both sides of it.
And I would add that, that's what makes it challenging and exciting. Our leaders are people. They're flawed and their lives are messy. We're all in the same boat in that sense. And so to be able to place them within a context of their evolving life, where do you start and where are you ending? What choices are you making along the way? That speaks to character to me in a different way than moments of time, just as it does with everyday people, the people who are pushing and fighting and struggling. I mean, those are choices that people are making, and those are stories. And too often, those are the story. We're talking about one thing, but let's talk about those stories, because that's what's making the change in the country evolve. It's weird, isn't it? We see it in the story all the time. This interplay between the people in power and then the people pushing and pulling about that, and how do you balance that, and how do you make that story real?
I think that one of the things that's interesting in the exhibit is very often people, I think that, a president acts in a certain way because they're motivated. It's all self-motivation. But, in politics, it's about pressure. It's about things being sort of pushed in certain directions. And I think one of the things that comes through very strongly in this exhibit is that to the extent that FDR acted on issues of racial equity, it's because the black community was organizing and placing pressure on him to do that. So he's doing the right thing, but he's doing it for political reasons. And it's not like presidents just wake up one day and decide, oh, I'm going to do this or that. It's politics. And I think that if there's one overarching theme, I think that the exhibit really, I hope, expresses is that if you want change, you have to organize, you have to exert pressure both from within the government, from outside the government. You see that throughout the exhibit. And it's an important thing to remember about politics in general, certainly in the period we're looking at.
Tell us a little bit, Herman, when we first, and Tanisha, made reference to that, when you first walk in and you were immersed in the exhibit, one of the central things is a sign that says colored. And one of the things that I've seen with the elementary school kids and even high school kids that come in, they don't get the impact of that. I mean, here's an artifact that, that is an authentic artifact that tells a story of a time when, certain people had to sit one place and other people had to sit in a different place. Could you tell us a little bit more about that particular, that artifact that you have there that...
Well, it's a sign that it's on loan to us. We borrowed some items for the exhibit from collectors, and this is a sign that was used in Tennessee in the 1930s and 40s to designate where you could sit on a streetcar, and it said colored on one side and white on the other. These were signs that were very common throughout the South in the 1930s and 1940s. We placed it in the first room because, and you've spoken to this already, about the way that first room is really designed. The first room in the exhibit is really designed, especially for younger people, to introduce them to this period in our history, to understand the scale of racial segregation and discrimination that existed not just in the South, but in the North and the West as well. So we immerse you in that, and I think that artifact is an attempt to kind of put it in bold perspective. But there are other elements in the exhibit in that front room, photography and documents that underscore that. And then we placed just opposite that in the same room. So you're on one side, you're learning about the context of the 1930s and 40s, just so you understand, what was going on in the country at large when FDR becomes president. But on the other side of that same room, we look at the Roosevelts prior to 1932, prior to when he's elected president. And what was their experience in terms of racial justice? What were their, for that matter, what interactions did they have with black people prior to 1932? And the answer is very little. It's very striking, especially with Eleanor Roosevelt, who we tend to remember rightly as a great pioneer and advocate for civil rights. But prior to 1932, this is just the reality. She had very little involvement or knowledge of anything in that area. And the same was true for Franklin Roosevelt. So that sort of sets you up. Once you understand that context, then you can go into the major part of the exhibit, which looks at the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s and in the 1940s, and you have a better understanding of what the bigger context is that they're operating in.
And the whole idea is to set that tone and then as sort of a baseline, right? To begin there and then see where the progression has gone on. But you say you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt, 32. What was her role in this? I mean, the president was responding to political pressure, but Mrs. Roosevelt was kind of way out ahead, wasn't she?
Well, this is one of the most interesting things in the exhibit because, again, I think when we think of Eleanor Roosevelt, we think of Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1950s when she's a full-blown, advocate for civil rights and very active in that period of her life. So again, it's very surprising to see that she had no involvement, literally none, before 1932. But what's interesting about Eleanor, and this is true, I think, of many aspects of Mrs. Roosevelt's public life, is how quickly she ramps up. She gets to Washington in 1933 when he's inaugurated president, and within months, she's meeting with civil rights leaders. Within months, she's investigating things. She's educating herself. And she moves really fast. FDR, the process is much slower. And it's also more political because he's operating as a national political leader.
It's political in a different way.
In a different way, yeah.
That's
a
our
good point.
internal conversation.
Yeah. But I think the thing about Eleanor, and it always interests us, at the library, is to see how quickly, when she engages with an issue, how quickly she moves. And I think, one of the things about Eleanor is that, and this becomes clear if you go through the exhibit, is she starts off in the 1930s as an advocate for inclusion of African Americans. They need to be included in all these New Deal programs. But by the 1940s, she's moved beyond that, and now it's about integration. It's not enough to be included, there has to be racial integration. So you see this progression in her public career that's just quite amazing. And then you get to the familiar Eleanor of the 1950s and 1960s, but now you understand where she was coming from.
Now, we all grew up with the civil rights movement as kind of background to a lot of other things that were going on. But Tanisha, what was it like going through the gallery with your grandma, who saw this stuff up front and personal, throughout her entire life, not as an afterthought or an afterglow or a background, but at a central location? That must have been something to go through that with her.
It was, and it was also emotional for her. I think painful histories for people who've lived through them, it doesn't carry on to generations. And so I grew up in a home and in a community in which my grandmother didn't talk a lot about this past. And so I was nervous about taking her to the exhibit, but I also wanted to give her the opportunity to go with me, and of course she was invited. And so, but just having her walk through and her say, like when we walked in and saw the images from the convention, the Democratic Convention, or she, learned about the Southern Democratic resistance, right? And that's why, right, FDR responded the way that he did to pushes for civil rights. I think she learned a different side. I think she understood that he wasn't doing a whole lot, and these policies were policies that didn't benefit her family, her father who was a veteran, her uncles who were veterans, right? The housing issues, right, in terms of redlining, et cetera, that we experienced living in Ohio, or she experienced living in Ohio. But her walking through, I think it gave her a different view of it. She didn't learn this in school, she lived it. And so that was a very small frame that she sort of understood these issues with. My grandmother, I'm a first generation college graduate, and so my grandmother didn't go to college. She was a factory worker her entire life. And so it's also interesting to just be able to allow this space to educate her in that kind of way. And then we got around to Mary Anderson, and she smiled, and we, saw the images related to like Black gospel music, and like it resonated with her. And so I thought that it was a teachable moment, but it was also a hard moment. And then we got all the way around the exhibit after we passed the sort of the spaces around Black veterans and integration in the military. And we watched the film. And I think for her, like that was particularly difficult, but also exciting to think about sort of everything with Eleanor Roosevelt's life and what she continued to do even despite her husband passing, and just the power, I think, of women. I would say, like, I grew up in a very women-dominated, women-centric family and community, and so I think that was also very inspiring for her.
I think that's fascinating that you make that point, because what we learned, because it was a huge learning process for us. You might hear it. I'm from the South. I'm from Alabama, and I will tell you, it's not a history I learned in school. And but the role of women in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and women's groups in communities and church groups was a huge catalyst for the efforts in the work. And we think of the civil rights movement as the 50s and 60s, which is just a piece of the civil rights movement, where women were more marginalized, frankly, in that era. And to see that early on and to learn that was fascinating for us. And then to think about your grandmother going through, I mean, we're hoping, that's what we hope when we do these things, that there's a connection there. Even, it is painful history, there's no question about it, right? But that's why it probably needs to be put out there.
I think it reminded me a lot of just the fact that I was going for myself, right, as a person who's interested in history, political history in particular, and thinking about my students, but just that we are all students, right, like learning this, and unless you've done the deep work, you've gotten a graduate degree in history, there's something there to learn, some piece of evidence to interrogate for yourself. And I think that was a really great experience for us.
There seems always to be a story just outside the story. And a lot of folks are familiar with the story, but the story just outside the story allows so much more depth and involvement and understanding to what the main story is. I think, Herman, you spoke about that with the group that we did for the lifelong learners, about having the Marian Anderson and the Tuskegee Airmen. Those are two big things that folks are pretty much familiar with, but there's so much of the rest of the story that you built around that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is sort of a hidden history of the early civil rights movement. I mean, again, we're familiar with the post-war story and the dramatic events of the 50s and 60s and the personalities, but what's revealing in this exhibit is to find that there are people who we are familiar with in that post-war period who are operating in the 30s and 40s. They're just younger. And they're laying the groundwork in so many ways for what comes after the war. And there are some really powerful personalities that I think we hope to amplify people's awareness of. I mean, I'll just cite Mary McLeod Bethune being one of the biggest. And here's a woman who comes into the Roosevelt administration in 1935. She's the racial advisor in the National Youth Administration, one of the big New Deal agencies, and she's just a powerhouse for advocating for African Americans within that program. She becomes the leader, the de facto leader of what's known as the Black Cabinet. And the Black Cabinet were black advisors who were placed in all the different government agencies during the New Deal to advocate for African Americans within those programs. Bethune, who by all accounts was just a magnetic personality, who owned the room when she came into it. She becomes the leader of all these advisors, most of whom were men. And my favorite photograph in the entire exhibit is, we blew it up, just gigantic, is a group photograph of the primary members of the Black Cabinet, and it's about 30 men, and in the center, front row, standing is Mary McLeod Bethune, and that was no mistake. She was there because she was really the primary person within that group. So I think the exhibit is trying to amplify and rescue some of these people from, who are not as well known perhaps as leaders in the post-war movement, but are very deserving of our attention. They're really doing fascinating things in the 30s and 40s.
And everyday Americans too. Just that great mass of people that we never put a name to, who are doing the work or experiencing just their everyday lives. Their letters and documents are in the collection as well. And it struck me certainly is there's no fear in talking to Bauer in those letters. There's one from a Poughkeepsie minister here writing to the president saying, you failed us. I mean, they're not holding back. But there are letters saying, oh my gosh, thank you for this opportunity. But there are plenty of letters where it's like, you're letting us down. What's going on here?
Yeah. Again, that idea of the mixed record and the mixed perceptions.
Well, one of the sources at the library, which we use a few of these letters in the exhibit, but if you come and do research at the library, it's one of the most fascinating collections. In 1935, FDR decides to send a circular letter out to to tens of thousands of religious leaders around the country. And the letter goes out, and basically he says in this form letter, you're a leader in your community. Write to me and tell me how the New Deal's doing and how's your community doing. And these letters went out to a lot of black ministers in the South. And they write back, and they're not holding back. They're pointing out where the New Deal is failing their community, and they're not mincing words. We use a few of those letters in the exhibit, but that is another example of sort of out there in the community, people are giving feedback, and to what extent did FDR react to that? I think one of the things that the exhibit demonstrates is that over time there is change. It's not complete, it's incremental. But it's coming because of, as you say, Bill, there's pressure coming from a lot of directions, whether it's within the administration, with figures like the members of the Black Cabinet, or from people outside the government who are writing, who are putting pressure through various organizations like the Urban League and the NAACP, And then one thing we haven't talked about at all, which is key to all of this is the period where African Americans come into the National Democratic Party. Prior to FDR, the black people who could vote, and that was people in the North and the West, they couldn't vote in the South, they were voting Republican. And that went back to Lincoln and Reconstruction and all of that. But by the 1930s, the National Republican Party was not really doing much for African Americans. And so when FDR arrives on the scene, you see this shift that comes about that's quite dramatic. And that has an impact. Again, if you're in the party, if you're in the coalition, you can demand a seat at the table, you can demand certain things in exchange for your votes.
One of the most dramatic and telling pieces in the exhibit is the red line map of Poughkeepsie. And you know, that really speaks volumes. How did your students react to that?
That's what I was curious about.
I think they learned redlining, right? They learned it wherever they came from, and they learned that it happened in other places, in Chicago, Cleveland, and these other places, but not here, not in Poughkeepsie. And I think they reflected, right? And they shared that they were surprised. And this is particularly true for the students in my law and courts class who had an assignment tied to the redlining map and thinking about housing loss and discrimination. But I think they were really surprised. The one thing that we did when we came back to the classroom was like, does this still impact? Is there a legacy of this? I said, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so then we talked about the districting of the local school districts, right? How there's Spack and Kill, there's Arlington, there's City of Poughkeepsie. We talked about outcomes. We talked about sort of issues within these communities that are absolutely related to redlining. And then also Vassar's complicity and gerrymandering the school district in that certain way. So it opened up, like this one map opened up the whole conversation in the classroom that we were able to have afterwards, which I thought was really nice. And so they got a chance to learn more, not just about the university and its role in terms of racial politics locally, but they had a chance also to think about something that they have learned, but also to make a connection to this is where you are currently.
Absolutely, right. You're walking down these streets
Literally.
that we see on this map that have been redlined out.
That's right.
We've had economics teachers and professors come in, and one of the striking things that they get students to understand from that map is that, you know, the redlining that occurred in the 1930s has had impacts for generations because it really begins to lead to sort of generational poverty, because if you can't get in the process to begin with, you have nothing to trade up along the way. So the fact that these lines exist still have an impact, you know, to this day.
That's why there's a frustration, I think, that I've felt or had when issues such as this are placed in really simple political yes, no, good guys, bad guys kind of thing. It's missing the point. It's not some kind of wokery or that kind of silliness that makes me so angry. It's actually that when you can't buy a house, then you're not, which is the major way Americans have accumulated wealth in this country. If you can't buy a house, then you can't pass on that wealth, and you know it's sort of fundamental, and it isn't Republican or Democrat.
Yeah.
That's just if you can't accumulate the wealth, you're not going to be able to advance.
Right. Yeah, I mean you're hobbled the minute the gate opens and off.
And it was nationwide. That's what I think struck me as a Southerner. I would expect that map in Birmingham. I've seen that map from Birmingham or Montgomery or wherever. Mm-hmm. But that there was one in Poughkeepsie. That surprised me. Cleveland, you know, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, all of them. It is that story of it wasn't a Southern question. Of course, it manifested itself in the South in different ways, often more violent ways. But if it's a national question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did your students, I'm curious, how did your students react to that and from notions of regionalism?
That was a huge thing in that first room, right? It was like Jim Crow in the North and Jim Crow in the South. They were way more familiar with Jim Crow in the South, right? That's sort of the stories that they had been told in terms of their schooling, right? Thinking about racial terror, thinking about lynching, et cetera. But it was the sort of manifestations of racism in the North. I think that surprised them, which is why the map also surprised me that it was like local. And so I think it did help them to sort of understand the sort of broad way that race has impacted sort of this nation, but I hope also thinking globally, right? Like thinking beyond just the South, which I think is just a very narrow way to sort of think about it. Yeah.
One of the things I love about the exhibit is that it introduces us to so many key players in the quest for civil rights. We've got Robert Vann, who's a leader in the Black press. And one of the connections I made with students was, we're talking about this guy who was very instrumental in the Black press, not only in Washington or New York, but all across the country. And students' eyes would kind of glaze over. And then one day, a student said, "Hey, he was like an influencer." And it's like, yes, that's exactly what he was like. He was an influencer. And then they all caught on and went on with that. So you've got him. You've got Mary McLeod Bethune, head of the National Youth Administration. You've got the civil rights leaders, Walter White, A. Philip Randolph. You've got Navyman and hero Dory Miller, singer Marian Anderson, and the list goes on and on. So you're introduced to all these incredible characters in the exhibit. Is there one that particular speaks to each of you? Like who's your favorite hero in the exhibit?
That's a great question.
Well, I will step in and say it's so hard for this is not a cop-out answer.
It sounds like the beginning of a cop-out answer.
I promise. It's that this wasn't like trying to find examples. Right? It wasn't as if we were desperately searching for things to fill out an exhibit. It's the sheer centrality of it all to the story and the amount of people within Black communities across the country in unions and politics and in churches. I think that's what struck me, is that this isn't some little piece of history where a couple of people stand out.
Right.
It is a huge part of it. It's central to the conversations during that era. So maybe that is a cop-out a bit, but
I'd point that out, but I know you're doing my evaluation next week.
I'll show Bill up because I do have a favorite.
Okay.
And it's hard because there's so many fascinating people, and I really do encourage you, if you haven't seen the exhibit, come, because you're going to discover people from history that are quite amazing. But the one that really stands out for me is A. Philip Randolph. Randolph was the head of the largest Black union in the country, the Sleeping Car Porters Union, and very heavily involved in politics. And he figures very heavily in our story during World War II, because he's one of the leaders pressuring Roosevelt to integrate the military and also the defense industries, which were basically the entire U.S. economy by the middle of the 1940s, by the early 1940s, were extremely racially discriminatory in terms of their hiring and what positions you could have. But what's interesting about Randolph, and that distinguishes him, I think, from other civil rights leaders in this period, is that he comes out of the labor movement, and I think he's more confrontational than some of the other leaders who are more apt to try to work the inner workings of politics in a more quiet way. And there's an event in the exhibit which I think is probably the pivotal moment in the entire story, which involves Randolph. So I'll just digress for a moment, since I'm saying why I find him so fascinating. From the very beginning of World War II, there was pressure from the Black community for integration of the military, which was totally segregated, and for greater equity in terms of these defense industries. They wanted better jobs. They wanted access to better jobs. But they weren't getting anywhere. And Randolph is the one who comes up with this idea that he's been trying through the inner workings of politics and working with Walter White and the NAACP, and they're not getting anywhere. So he decides the way to do this is to mount some outside pressure. And he creates an organization called the March on Washington Movement. And the idea of this movement was they set up chapters around the country, and the goal was to get 100,000 black people to come to Washington, D.C. and march in Washington, D.C. On July 1st, 1941, to protest segregation in the military and the inequities in the defense industries. That got FDR's attention in a way that nothing else would have, because frankly, we have documents in the exhibit that show there was sort of panic at the White House that this was going to happen. And what comes out of it is he meets with Randolph and with Walter White of the NAACP at the White House in the Oval Office, directly because of this threat that's being put. They have this meeting. It's about 10 days before this big march is going to take place. And in the meeting, FDR tries to get him to back down. You know, can't we talk about this? We'll negotiate. And Randolph just completely stands firm. And what comes out of that is he doesn't get everything he wants. Roosevelt refuses to budge on integration of the military, but what he does do is he issues an executive order outlawing racial discrimination in the defense industries and setting up a commission that would investigate issues and resolve them that involved the Fair Employment Practices Commission. So what am I trying to say with all of this? What I'm saying is that Randolph is interesting to me because he understands, I think, the power dynamic better than even some of the other civil rights leaders at the time, and realizes that the way you've got to work the inner workings of politics, but sometimes you've also got to have outside pressure. And he gets half of what he wants at that meeting, which is, again, I think interesting. And I'll just say one more thing about that meeting, because we make a big deal of it in the exhibit, prior to that in the exhibit, you're seeing efforts to get FDR to move, and FDR's moving incrementally, but there's never any moment where there's a direct confrontation. That happens in that meeting in June of 1941. And what's significant is FDR moves, and he does the right thing, but he does it because of political pressure. It's totally clear. He's reluctant, he's nervous about it, but he does it because he sees that he has to make a compromise.
Anybody else want to share a favorite? Yeah.
I would say, I love Mary McLeod Bethune, but I would say Eleanor Roosevelt. And I knew about her in terms of her latter years, but I think her openness to use her positionality, right? Her openness to engaging with Black civil rights leaders and activists, to write letters and correspond with, meet with. I think it highlights the kind of multiracial solidarity that is necessary for advancement, for civil rights. And I think she sort of, in doing this, she models that for a lot of people. And this is one of the things that the students remarked on is, thinking about first ladies of this, like their lives, like their lifetimes, and thinking about the kind of quote unquote pet projects that they may have. But to think about the real work that she did in this relationship, to think about like political pressure, but like differently, right? Mm-hmm. In this marriage with FDR and, talking to him, having conversation with him, humanizing this side, right? Humanizing these issues. And I think it's really important, the role that she played and the role that's necessary, that it can't be just sort of, Black Americans who we see at the sort of forefront of this, and that's amplified by this exhibit, their work, their activism, right? Their organizing, strategizing, et cetera. But I think this other aspect of it, which is her sort of being who she is, having the access that she did, and using that in a way that I think points towards justice.
That's great. Yeah, access and as you say, the personification. She didn't like to speak in numbers, 30% of the farmers. She'd bring in, old MacDonald. And when you're looking in his eyes and you're seeing the stress and the pressure, it's a lot harder to turn from that.
It is interesting in that way because it isn't always that she's putting a memo, talk about this issue, FDR, because she would put things in a basket for him to read it in the evening. And they were little notes sometimes, and they were very sharp sometimes. But it's often you need to meet with so-and-so. Yep. You need to sit down with so-and-so. And he would occasionally, no, I don't have time, we'll write a letter, send a photograph. And I'm thinking of some Black campaign workers after 44. And she's like, that's not going to be enough. You've just won this election. And by 44, I mean, that vote was important. Let's just get down to hard, cold politics on it.
Absolutely.
And she's like, that's not going to be enough. You need to meet with these 3 people. Not just this idea of serving people, but
These are the,
people.
yeah,
Yeah.
get this going. All right, so we have a few minutes left, and before we open to questions from the audience, so let's take a time leap and let's go 50 years into the future. It's 2075.
I've got to worry about next year's budget.
Well,
50 years.
I don't think you're going to have much to worry about. But it's 2075, and an exhibit like this gets mounted. With 50 years ahead of us, what do you think an exhibit like that in 2075 would look like? How would it differ from the exhibit that we have currently? And what message should it bring to the people of 2075? I mean, you two will be gone. Tanisha and I might still be here, but
Thank you.
I think the message would be the same. I hope the message is the same, which is, and I've said it a couple of times in this panel, but I'll say it again because it bears repeating, that, political change does not just come out of, the thin air. It doesn't come because a president wakes up one morning and decides to do something. It's all about politics is pressure, and that can come in different forms, again, within the government, from outside the government, but that's how change comes about. And I think that message, I think, will be just as important, 50 years, did you say?
50 years, yeah.
From now as it is today.
Yeah, and don't assume that because the way things are is the way they're going to be. Because that's the fastest way. Rights gained are not rights guaranteed. I'm a gay man as well as a Southerner, and sitting here, it is exactly that. Work, and that if it doesn't go 100% the way you want it to, that doesn't mean you throw everything out. You have to keep working at it. Nothing's ever going to be perfect.
And I would say the same thing. I would say something similar in terms of it not being linear, that there are these backlashes that happen with progress, and that in moments of controversy, hopelessness, I think a lot of students, even in this moment, are reeling, right, from recent election, for example. But like to go back to the roots of the work, which is always community. It's community-based work. It's organizations, nonprofits. It's taking care of each other. It's developing a ethics of care, community care, politics of care, and ensuring and sort of, I would say pushing from the outside or from within for the folks who are supposed to be leading us to make sure that we are cared for.
And do you think the students are getting that? Do you think they're
I think they do.
they're responding?
I think that they respond in that way. I mean, I supervise a lot of students who are doing like community engaged learning and internships.
Awesome.
And it's interesting to see the pivot from big corporate law, for example, which is what I saw sort of thinking about, the recession, and people think about, okay, I need a job, so I'm going to go to corporate law, right?
Right.
But now seeing people talk more about like public interest law and wanting to think about working with legal clinics and legal services, legal aid, et cetera. So I do think they are getting this sense of the community-based work, but they grew up in a time in which it wasn't as visible as it was for people who grew up in the 60s, right? And so they have to learn those skills to develop them. And I think an exhibit, right, can help them with that.
Yeah, the last portion of our exhibit is like a 6-minute movie that sort of recaps everything that was in the exhibit and speaks to this idea that if you don't keep the pressure moving forward, you're going to slip back. And that the responsibility to not only future generations, but also to the generations that have already suffered so much to bring this about is that we can't give up the ground. We've got to hold our ground. We've got to, keep it moving. And, maybe it'll move quickly, maybe it won't, but you can't lose that ground because ground lost is ground that has to be made back up again.
Yeah, and democracy's messy.
Yes.
It's a messy business, but it's the possibility there. That's why 50 years from now, I would hope maybe it is good we would be having a similar conversation. There is no perfection to be had.
Right.
So it's how are you moving it forward? How are you always trying to make some positive change?
Excellent. Excellent. Now, Andrew, I understand we're taking questions from the audience.
Absolutely. So before we take Q&A, please join me in thanking Jeffrey, William, Tanisha, and Herman. Thank you. All right, so for Q&A, hey, Todd Wilmot, could you do me a favor? Check in with Jeff there. I believe we have microphones. Yeah, that would be super useful. And there they are, right on cue. So if Todd, if you don't mind, he's going to come down and show of hands would be great. Could we have a question from the audience? And we'll start. Thanks, Todd, up here with Dick Raitano.
So tonight, Todd is playing the part of Phil Donahue. No.
Technology.
Well, Dick, if you want to ask the question, one of us with a microphone can repeat it.
Check. Here we go.
Oh, there we go.
I admit that I
Nope,
am
that's still not
a
it.
FDR junkie in the sense that I think he's the greatest president in American history. Really believe that. That said, to what extent do you think his views on civil rights were political? You mentioned that, versus his own prejudice against black people. In other words, if I'm not asking for an estimate, 50-50 or something like that, but to what extent was his view of civil rights really influenced by his own prejudices?
FDR is a very hard person to. He's a very guarded person. He didn't keep a diary. He didn't let people take notes in cabinet meetings. He liked to work on the phone. So getting to his inner thinking very often is difficult. He's not like some presidents where they're writing things down. What I think, and I'm sure others will have other things to say, what I think about FDR is that he was always thinking about what can I accomplish politically. In other words, he's always reading the situation very clinically. I don't think he's opposed to helping, to change things in terms of race in the country, but he's always figuring out what can I get done, how can I get it done. One of the things that is really important in the exhibit, and we haven't talked about it up till now, is the fact that, FDR comes into office, he's a landslide, right? He's comes in, has a huge Democratic Congress, but the Congress was dominated by Southern Democrats. And especially in the Senate, where they controlled most of the committees, and the majority leader was a Southerner, and they also had the filibuster, they could kill civil rights legislation anytime they wanted to. And he's forced, in time after time after time, to accommodate these Southerners when he's trying to get his New Deal through. There's an amazing meeting he has with Walter White, head of the NAACP, in 1934. He meets with him at the White House, and we have the account from Walter White in his autobiography. And White's trying to get FDR to come out in favor of a federal anti-lynching bill, which was pending in Congress at the time. And FDR says, look, I agree with you on the legislation, but I'm not going to come out in public for it. And the reason he gives Walter White is he said, if I come out for that bill, all the Southerners who I need to pass all of my New Deal legislation are going to balk, and it's going to derail the whole program. So I'm raising this point because that's how FDR, he's looking at the situation politically and trying to do what he can where he can, and he makes progress over time, especially as time goes on and African Americans come into the National Democratic Party and start to have more influence. Politically, FDR sees, okay, I have some room here to operate, but he's always looking at it that way. I don't think, and again, I'll be interested in what others say, I don't think he was, prejudiced against black people. He just was always figuring it in terms of what can I accomplish, and reading that situation when he makes decisions.
I think that, oh, go ahead, PJ.
I think it's a great question. It's a complicated one. I think of the work of Beverly Daniel Tatum, which says that racism is in the air. We don't see it. We all take it in. And so in that way, I think that even though we don't have the direct evidence from his personal writings and things, I think of the time. I think a lot about like the anthropological concept of like cultural relativism, of trying to assess people and their actions and their decisions in the moment, the context in which they made them, and not from the current present moment, right, of analysis. But it reminds me of sort of thinking about, like colorblindness, the kind of colorblind approach, a kind of, I'm not really seeing them. I don't, like they're not the majority of the country. And even in this area, what does all of this mean for him? And I think without him having a firm stance, and he had to know the New Deal concessions that were made were going to disproportionately impact Black Americans and write them out of that safety net that was meant to, help people during the Great Depression. It's hard to also see that as not being motivated, or at least even if it wasn't intentionally him doing it against, he allowed that to happen. I think we have to say that that is something that was a decision that he made, even if it was for political reasons.
And, it's interesting, and is that I would, within his time, that absorption of just the world around, right. You didn't think about it overtly. You didn't have to. Yep. And so that by not thinking about it is not an excuse in a way, but because at that time, we're not just applying ideas now to that era. That's an artificial construct to me, because it was wrong then, and there were people who knew that and argued about that, and who pointed those things out. So I think we have to hold him account. I think about political capital, and when you've got a great deal of political capital, and he had a lot of political capital, and there were Republicans who would have probably worked with them, and some Democrats on that. I think it's sometimes we fall back on, and I don't mean that in an ugly way, on the notion of, well, he couldn't accomplish this or that because, I don't know, I think that he didn't choose to get to your point. He didn't necessarily try to.
I think Doris Kearns summed it up once very well when she said that what made the Roosevelts such a great team is that Mrs. Roosevelt was always focused on what should be done, and FDR was always focused on what could be done. Mm-hmm. And they were both kind of futurists. They both sort of took stock of where they were, saw where they wanted to be, and then worked to build bridges to that. And I think, President Roosevelt was very consistent across the board. I mean, that was always his approach. Let me see where I can go. He did the same thing with banking. He did the same thing with, farm reform. He did the same, every single thing was, let me push as far as I can. When it looks like I'm going to start annoying somebody too much that they're going to pull the rug on my programs, I'll stay put or I'll back off. And over the course of time, as Martin Luther King said, the arch of justice is long, but it bends, or the arch of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And
he sometimes did things in ways that were not visible, but had great impact. I'll just cite one we make a big deal of in the exhibit. In 1932, when he's inaugurated, not inaugurated, when he's at the Democratic National Convention, that's where we start the exhibit. And we point out that at that convention, there was not a single black delegate. There had never been a black delegate at any Democratic National Convention going all the way back to the founding of the party in the 1820s, because it was a Southern-dominated party at that time. So that was the party that nominates him in 1932. Well, what happens in 1936 when he's running for the second time? You have black delegates at the convention for the first time in the history of the party. And then there's something that happens at that convention that is definitely FDR, but he's doing it through surrogates. Prior to 1936, and this had always been the policy in the National Democratic Party, at their convention, if you were going to get nominated as president, you had to get 2/3 of the votes. 2/3, not a simple majority. 2/3 of the delegates had to vote for you. And why was that? It gave the South a veto over any presidential nominee. So the only way you'd get nominated is if you made a deal with the Southerners. What happens at the 1936 convention? That rule is changed to a simple majority, and it's remained that way ever since. That was FDR who did that. Now, did he walk in front of the convention and say, I'm making this change? No, he was riding high, he was very popular, he got his surrogates to do it, and that had a profound effect long-term on the Democratic Party because it took away the Southerners' veto. I mention this only because I agree with a lot of what's been said here. I think when he would tend to sometimes do things in a quiet way through surrogates, again, always looking at it politically, always figuring out what he could do.
Check. As curators and archivists, I'm curious what you learned from the exhibit and how you might carry that forward for the rest of the museum and future exhibits.
Well, yes, go ahead.
Sure. Well, one thing we're doing, and we're in the process of it right now, is the exhibit's open until the end of February. But what we're doing is we're taking elements from that temporary exhibit and we're incorporating it into our permanent exhibit. So when you come back to the museum, hopefully these changes will be in place by the spring, you'll find several places in the exhibit where we are adding a lot of new content based on the work and the research that went into this particular exhibit. So we didn't want to just feel like the exhibit was closed and, we're done with that story. We always try, with all of our temporary exhibits, if there's content that we feel is very vital, we try to weave it then into our permanent exhibition. So we're in the process of doing that now.
I would think it's going to be more visible than I recall it being, because there are moments in time which gets back to the centrality of these issues. These were not peripheral issues in this country during that era. That just has to be impressed upon everyone, I think, that this isn't some little side question going on over here. It informs so much of what's occurring. But in terms of the archives then, in relation to that, it's how you choose to value materials and what's valued within the collection. Obviously, everything that's in those 17 million pages has been determined to be permanent, so they all have value. That said, those materials reflecting everyday people, the correspondence from the American people, which is very personal, and it really hadn't occurred in the way it did with the Roosevelts prior, because of radio, their engagement in the media, the impact of the programs on people's lives. Those materials were never considered of any particular, deep value. It was all the, important materials that are important about leadership during the war, about making the decision. Of course, those need to be studied and are there. But those others are, in fact, equally valuable because they are telling this richer story. They are evidence of that engagement. Evidence, and that's what all of this is evidence. It's not speculation. It may be our interpretation of it, but it's based on evidence. It's not fake. It's not just opinion. It's working with that. I think it's so important that, we just make sure there is room, and that's our responsibility, for that full story. And that includes the records, the space on the wall, and the education programs, and the space for scholars to come ask different questions. To know that collection is richer than it may have been presented in the past. I would be interested in your perspective as someone who conducts research.
Yeah, I remember leaving the first time that I went after I had engaged with some material and I studied racial diversity in the federal judiciary, as well as the state judiciary. But I remember encountering in one of the letters that, and I don't remember who wrote it, but it was to Eleanor saying he should appoint the first Black federal judge. And it was an attorney from New York City, I think it was. And so I said, I need to go into the archive. I mean, I got excited. I was like, I'm right here in New York. I can go to New York City. I can figure out who this person is. I can go into this archive. Did he consider this person? And so I think it opens up the door for scholars who are wanting to, access new material. And to have it right here, sort of local. I mean, I've been to the National Archive. I've done research there in terms of the legislative archive. But I think for me, I'm really interested in the start of federal judicial diversity, and that is absolutely with FDR, thinking about Florence Allen, et cetera. And so I think it's important to have this resource in our community as a scholar.
It's if we ever get bored or think the work's done at a archives museum or an institution like ours, then we're in the wrong jobs, because it never does, and it can always be looked at fresh and new.
And that's
you know that as a teacher.
Oh yeah, and that's the amazing thing. It's like, if I have to go to the dry cleaner and, get a haircut in the same week, that's a busy week for me. But when you look at what and the haircut, right? So it doesn't take long. But, now when you look at the 17.5 million pages of documents, and certainly the president wasn't involved in every one of those, but it's mind-boggling, the things that this guy was involved with, the details this guy had to take a look at. He got us through a Great Depression and a World War back to back. President for 12 years. So there's always something new to learn. There's always some new document. There's always, they're there, but there's always some new discovery of something in the documents, and that's what makes it such a cool place to work.
And it is remarkable to see how people evolve over time. And that is just ultimately the lesson that I take away from all of it, is seeing, and people evolve differently. They have different rates, they accomplish different things, but that's just fundamentally to me what you see in the stories in that library of everyday people and the Roosevelts. That's why we're tough on the Roosevelts at the library. Yeah. Not in a cruel way or a mean way, but we're there. Personally, it feels like every day with these materials in ways that are, it's very special. And
it's not just us. I mean, we have 600 researchers a year that come to the site, and thousands more that use Franklin, our online search engine and such. So, you're excited about that letter. That is not much interest to me, but somebody else, it is from the standpoint, but there's other things that, people are obsessed with Fala, people are obsessed with, so there's so many things that people can use as entry points into this material. It's incredible, really.
And FDR valued the letters from everyday people. That's what he said. And we have the pro and the con. I want to be super clear that it isn't all just lionizing at the time. Some of the letters from the everyday people to both of them are tough.
Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Join me in giving it up for Herman Eberhard. Come on, let's hear it. For William Harris. For Dr. Tanisha Means, and for our moderator, Jeffrey Urban.
And I would just like to wish all of you a very happy, safe, and meaningful Thanksgiving coming up next week. And I hope you have many, many things to be thankful for. And one thing that I will get you started with is that you still have 3 months to see this exhibit. So you should be thankful for that.
Come see the exhibit.
Over in Hyde Park.
And thank you for coming tonight. Thank you very much.